Super telephoto zoom lenses are great value for money, and if you're a photographer, I definitely would recommend one. But would I recommend this one here, the brand new Canon RF 100-400mm f5.6 to f8? Well, let's find out in this lens review, and I'm going to start right now. Now, this lens has got a lot to live up to. Its main competition within the Canon RF lineup is the ludicrously expensive and absolutely amazing Canon RF 100-500mm. Now, obviously, this lens isn't going to be as good, but for 3 times cheaper, it just might be worth a spot in your camera bag. So let's find out by first looking at the build quality. Now, the idea for this lens is it's designed to be as small and as lightweight as possible, and that definitely does get reflected within the build quality. It isn't as well built as other super telephoto zoom lenses I have tested on this channel. It isn't as good as the Canon RF 100-500mm, and I also say it's not as good as the Canon EF 100-400mm. Now, this lens isn't designed to replace that particular lens, the 100-400mm from the EF range, simply because that is a L series lens. This lens falls in almost a subcategory below that, almost replacing the Canon EF 70-300mm. So really, this is a new style lens designed by Canon. Now, this lens has 12 elements in 9 groups, and it doesn't come with weather sealing, and it also doesn't have a metal construction. The only metal part of this lens is actually the metal mount. So overall, the build quality is good, but if you're after exquisite build quality or possibly weather sealing, I could highly recommend other lenses, like for instance the Canon RF 100-500mm or the Canon EF 100-400mm. So because of that, I'm only going to be giving it a 7 out of 10. So moving on to image quality. Now, this is where this lens is going to be fairly interesting. Comparing it to the 100-500mm, again, is fairly unfair. The price disparity between these two lenses is fairly extreme, but let's see how well it stacks up to that lens, especially when you're thinking about its price point. So I went ahead and used this lens for its intended use, wildlife photography. A 100-400mm is great for a variety of different styles of photography, but more specifically for wildlife and sport. Now, I was actually really impressed by the quality of the images. I thought in daylight, the actual image sharpness was really good. There was a good amount of contrast, and from the actual face of it, there didn't look like there was a lot of chromatic aberration. The main issue you found with this lens is its aperture. It is quite dark, and it does mean it has a larger depth of field, and it isn't great for low light photography. Now, in daylight, in normal conditions, you wouldn't really notice a difference, I don't think, with the image quality versus the more expensive 100-500mm. But where you will start to notice is definitely in the low light performance. The 100-500mm is going to outperform this lens simply because of its larger aperture, which means you're going to have to crank the ISO up on this lens, which means you are going to get grainier images. But let's have a look at this lens more scientifically by pointing it at the graph. So straight out of gate at 100mm at f5.6, as you can see, the center sharpness is really good. But if we go ahead and look at the corners, they are noticeably softer. Now, to sharpen this up, all you need to do is step down to f8. This is where I found this lens performed at its best, either 100 or 400mm. If we go anything beyond this, I did notice that diffraction did start playing a more prominent role, making the center and corners a little bit softer. Not by a noticeable amount, but it was definitely noticeable on the graph. Then if we go ahead and zoom in at 400mm, the new minimum aperture is f8. And if we go and have a look at the center sharpness, you can see it is really sharp. And again, looking at the corners, you can see that sharpness is definitely reflected. So if we go ahead and step down to another stop to f11, you will start to notice diffraction starting to take a little bit more of a prominent role. Again, not by a noticeable amount on normal photos, but you can definitely see it on the graph image. So let's go and have a look at distortion and vignetting, and I must say it is very positive. There is very little distortion wide open at 100mm, and there's a small amount of vignetting, but you can completely remove that by stepping down from f5.6 to f8. So let's go ahead and zoom into 400mm. Now there's a slight amount of pincushion distortion, a very small amount, almost not noticeable. And again, the same situation with vignetting. Very little vignetting, which I think is a real good positive. And to remove what is very little, you can step down to F11, and as you can see, it is completely removed. So this is a really good score for distortion and vignetting. And lastly, let's go and have a look at flaring. And again, a really good positive. Very little flaring and a good amount of contrast within this lens. I must say, I thought this lens performed really well when it was pointed at bright lights. So if you're thinking of using this lens for maybe aerial or bird photography, this lens should definitely be worth a spot in your camera bag. So overall, I thought the image quality was really good. Nothing compared to the 100 to 500mm. I do think that lens is sharper in the corner, but also in the center. And obviously it did outperform it when it comes to its aperture. You wouldn't notice much of a difference, I think, in normal lit environments, but as soon as the sun starts to drop or you're shooting in a darker environment, the 100 to 500mm is going to outperform this lens simply because of its aperture. But the big benefit to that, it makes this lens a lot smaller. So overall, I think the image quality is good, but not necessarily great. So I'm going to be giving it a 7 out of 10. So now let's move on to size and weight. And this is where this lens really does shine versus the other lenses we're going to be talking about today. Coming in at just 635 grams. This lens is also quite small as well. As you can see by the size graph here, this lens is by far the smallest on our list. It's almost the same size as the 70 to 300mm, while offering a larger focal length from 100 to 400mm. The next lens we can talk about is the Canon RF 100 to 500mm. This lens comes in at over double the weight, coming in at a whopping 1,530 grams. This lens is also far larger as well. The other lens we can talk about is the Canon EF 100 to 400mm. This lens comes in at a whopping 1,640 grams, but by far the largest and heaviest on our list today. So as you can see, if you're after a small, lightweight zoom lens that offers a 100 to 400mm, realistically, this is the only lens that is going to suit you. And I must say, carrying it around in a day-to-day environment, I barely noticed it, and it just felt like a normal zoom lens. So this is a big positive for this lens. Really good if you're after a small, lightweight, super telephoto zoom lens. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. So moving on to autofocus and image stabilization, we're also going to have a quick look of what this lens is like for video. Well, actually, the autofocus surprised me, but in a good way. This lens actually has the same autofocus motor that the 100 to 500mm has. That is the Nano USM, which makes this lens incredibly fast to autofocus. Compared to the older 70 to 300 or 100 to 400mm, this is far more successful, especially when you place it obviously with a mirrorless camera. Now the autofocus of this lens is really quick and really silent. I'd also say it's fairly successful as well. And I'd also say the same when it comes to the image stabilization. It isn't the full hybrid image stabilization that you get with the 100 to 500mm, but it is still up to 4 stops, which can help in a lower lit environment. The image stabilization also really helps when it comes to video. The video side of things, I was pleasantly surprised. Now, it wasn't the fastest to focus when it was in video, but I must say you can get cracking images, especially when you couple this with either the Canon EOS R5 or R6. I was really happy with the actual video that I got, and I must say I would highly recommend it if you're more of a documentary filmmaker. This lens definitely would be a spot in your camera bag just because of how small and lightweight it is. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a whopping 9 out of 10 for its autofocus and image stabilization. So last but most importantly is price. Now this is where this lens really does shine versus the other lenses because of how cheap this lens is. Compared to the other RF 100 to 500mm, this is an absolute bargain. This lens comes in at just £699. That might seem a lot of money for a Canon RF lens, but when you compare it to the Canon RF 100 to 500mm, that lens comes in at almost £3,000, coming in at £2,979. So you can really see the value for money that this lens offers. Now, if we compare it to the older EF 100 to 400mm, that comes in again a whopping price of £2,499. £589. And realistic, the only lens that even comes close to this lens here is the older Canon EF 70-300mm. That lens comes in at a reasonable £639. So realistically, you can be comparing these two lenses here, the 100-400 versus the 70-300. The other two lenses are far out of the budget for most photographers. And if you're looking at this lens versus the 100-500mm, this lens is going to outperform that lens simply because of its price point. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it an 8 out of 10. So quickly moving on to pros and cons to find out, is this lens really worth a spot in your camera bag? Let's go and have a look at the pros first. This lens has got cracking image quality. I really like the contrast and I really like the sharpness, especially when you think about price point. This lens is also really small and really light, by far the smallest 100-400mm I have ever tested. This lens is also really good for value for money, especially when you compare it to the ludicrously expensive 100-500mm. So as you can see, decent amount of pros, but let's go and have a look at the cons. The image quality is good, but definitely not great. And the 100-500mm blows it out the water when it comes to its overall image quality. This lens has also got quite a dark aperture from f5.6 all the way to f8. So for low light environments, pretty much a no-go. And it also hasn't got the great build quality. No weather sealing for a super telephoto zoom lens, not necessarily great, but I understand why. So a decent amount of pros and a decent amount of cons. So really it works out what you're after. If you're after a small, lightweight, super telephoto zoom lens with decent image quality, to be honest, this lens has been designed for you. But if you're after something a little bit better, a little bit sharper, and to be honest, better built, then the 100-500mm is the lens for you.